Now, continuing with the second reading has the title Man Knows Analogously to God's Knowing, and this one has 5 sub-readings labeled A, B, C, D, E. The A reading emphasizes that humanity is divided into 2 groups, or can be divided into 2 groups, the covenant keepers and the covenant breakers, and that the status of being a covenant breaker or a covenant keeper is what's going to drive you to either accept the revealed model or fall back on a form of monism. So he concludes this section describing the unbeliever as, quote, using the gift of logical manipulation given to him for the purpose of thinking God's thoughts after him on a created scale, in order thus to form an analogical system that in some measure reflects the plan of God, he absolutizes himself and compels the nature of reality to be equal to the reach of his logical thought. The B reading, starting on page 251, defines univocal versus analogical thinking again. And I think we've discussed that pretty thoroughly with the earlier reading and with Bahnsen's material, so I don't need to repeat it. He just makes an interesting point that even our concepts of God are like finite replicas of God. The last paragraph, he says, when we speak of our concept or notion of God, we should be fully aware that by that concept we have an analogical reproduction of the notion that God has of himself. Our notions or concepts are finite replicas of God's notions. Which is a little bit enigmatic because our concept can say God is infinite in his power, for example, or he's not limited spatially, so he's infinite spatially. And so even though our concepts are what Van Til calls finite, they reference the infinite formally. But of course, we only know through analogies and intuition what that really means. So if we said, like, for example, God is infinite like the number line is infinite, what we mean is there's no terminus of that number line. For any x that we tick off on the axis, you can picture it going x plus 1. So it's somewhat of a formal concept. So we don't embrace the concept of the infinity of God the way he embraces it, would be the point. Now the C reading, Van Til emphasizes that man is analogous to God in 3 ways: his thinking, his willing, and his doing. So thought or reason, willing or the will, and doing are all analogous, are all analogs of God. So he makes the interesting point here on page 252. It is only after refusing to be analogous to God that man can think of setting a contrast between the attitude of reason to one type of revelation and the attitude of faith to another type of revelation. So there's a hint of countering St. Thomas, who saw the way of reason taking you up to God in many respects, and then needing to sprout the wings of faith to continue to the full orbed revelation of God. And Van Til is pointing out that that's incorrect once you understand the knowledge situation as it applies to both aspects of man's knowledge. This is continued in further detail as we go to reading number D, bottom of page 252. We cannot avoid coming to a clear-cut decision with respect to the question as to whose knowledge, man's or God's, shall be made the standard of the other. The one must be original and the other analogical of the original. The one must be determinative and the other subordinate. Roman Catholic theology seeks to serve two masters here. It too speaks of created being and human knowledge as being analogical of divine being and divine knowledge, but it does not really take this seriously. In its philosophy and apologetics, Romanism reasons as though man can, by himself, determine the nature and possibility of knowledge without reference to God. On the other hand, it refers to mysteries as being above the understanding of man. But as Protestants, we should definitely choose to make God the original in the knowledge situation, i.e. in both the first method and the second method of Aquinas. He has the analogy of the city on page 253, and that is when an architect designs a city and we're not in the city, if there's a road that goes into the city, then that same road comes from the city back out to the subject. As a thought picture for how it is that we can know God. If he can reveal to us, then we can know him. So it's just possibly a helpful mental picture. He makes the point on page 254 that there's a sense in which we are rationalists, but that's only because we're floating in the thoroughly rational knowledge system of God through revelation. When we say that God is transcendent above us, or when we say that God is the absolutely other, we do not mean that there is not a rational relation between God and us. As God created us in accordance with his plan, that is, as God created us in accordance with his absolute rationality, so there must be a rational relationship from us to God. Christianity is, in the last analysis, not an absolute irrationalism, but an absolute rationalism. In fact, we may contrast every non-Christian epistemology with Christian epistemology by saying that Christian epistemology believes in an ultimate rationalism, while all other systems of epistemology believe in an ultimate irrationalism. And finally, he concludes this section with man in three of his estates, creation and righteousness, fallen and redeemed, and interplays with this theme of the knowledge situation being monistic or Christian in each of those three estates in sort of an obvious kind of way, I think. And then the E reading, he illustrates the knowledge situation by speculating as to what it would have been like for man in his primal state. And this is going to be adding some richness to recall Calvin's opening of the Institutes, where he expresses that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to decide whether the knowledge of self or the knowledge of God comes first. They're correlative. Very difficult. Van Til endorses that model, but he's going to add a little bit of interesting nuance here. So he says, page 258, we may perhaps clarify what is meant by the consciousness of man as being originally revelational if we say that man would naturally, by virtue of his thought activity, know and come to know ever more fully the true state of affairs about the universe in general and about himself in particular. He would, in the field of metaphysics, know and recognize the fact that he was a creature. Hence, he would know in the field of knowledge that in the nature of the case he could be no more than a reinterpreter. That is, he would recognize at once that the possibility of predication presupposed the existence of God as absolute. So there, he's highlighting there's a formal aspect to what's revealed, that just by the virtue of revealing himself as the all-powerful creator, God also reveals a formal principle of how knowledge is possible, predication is possible, because of him being the creator that's also created me. in his image. And therefore, I have the confidence to go out and learn things about the universe, knowing that I can form true results, propositions. Continuing. In paradise, man made his self-consciousness the immediate but wholly derivative starting point, while he made the self-consciousness of God the remote but wholly ultimate starting point of all of his knowledge. So that's the insight that I thought was interesting. So in a sense, our self-consciousness is the immediate starting point, because we can't get out of our own skin, but yet wholly derivative. So immediate but derivative, while the knowledge of God is remote and yet originary, the ultimate starting point. Then he moves on to a brief summary of the whole history of philosophy, and with a focus on man's hubris. He says the Greek thinkers were as children who thought they could do everything. Even in modern times, we have, in such systems as that of Leibniz, a striking manifestation of the pride, hubris of the sinner who wishes to be as God. In more recent times, however, men have become more sophisticated. They have given up the quest for certainty and the quest for comprehension, except as a limiting concept. In modern irrationalism, the prodigal has recognized that he is at the swine trough, but still refuses to return to the Father's house. His hubris never forsakes him. So in this arc of history, we kind of see childlike confidence at the beginning, blossoming into we can learn everything about the universe, culminating with Leibniz, and then finally that collapses under the forces that we've gone into in the past and might and again in the future, but essentially crumbling over the 200 years since the Enlightenment into different forms of existentialism and despair, giving up the quest for certainty, but still that same hubris or pride still operative because men refuse to return to the Father's house. I thought that was quite interesting. And finally, we come to the third major reading on page 259, which Bahnsen gives the title Rational and Empirical Knowledge Affirmed. So this is the corresponding to that third category that we had last time on empirical knowledge and its possibility. Skipping a couple paragraphs, he then addresses Clarke's objection that we also talked about, Clarke's objection to the empiricism. He says, it is customary on the part of some Orthodox theologians to depreciate the objects of sensation as a source of knowledge. They have become deeply convinced of the skepticism involved in historical empiricism. They would therefore substitute an a priori approach for that of the empiricist, thinking that thus they represent biblical thought. 2 points may be mentioned with respect to this. In the first place, to flee to the arms of an a priorism from those of empiricism is in itself no help at all. It is only if an a priori is self-consciously based upon the conception of the ontological trinity rather than upon the work of Plato or some other non-Christian philosopher that it can safeguard against skepticism. The a priori of any non-Christian thinker will eventually lead to empiricism. It can keep from doing so only if it keeps within the field of purely formal predication. In the second place, if we do place the ontological trinity at the foundation of all our predication, then there is no need to fear any skepticism through the avenue of sense. So that's an interesting dilemma that he sets up. On the one hand, if you propose a priorism, purely a priori type of knowledge access, then the question is, well, is this an a priorism such as Plato used, or man setting himself up as the standard and merely reflecting, or is it going to be derived from God's thoughts and God's revelation? And he makes the interesting side note that the man-centered a priorism invariably collapses because it can't connect to the world and morphs itself into an empiricism. Plato leads to Aristotle, you could almost say. But then on the other hand, if you're willing to start with the Christian view, namely the revelation of the self-contained God, then he's the one that created our senses and the physical things and so forth, and commends our ability to learn things about these things. And then he anticipates the objection that sensation can deceive us. Gordon Clark loved to talk about how if you put a stick in the water, it looks like it's bent, but we say it's not really bent. Van Til. Sensation does deceive us, but so does ratiocination. We have the means for their corruption in both cases. The one without the other is meaningless. Both give us true knowledge on the right presupposition. Both lead to skepticism on the wrong presupposition. So I think that's insightful. One thing he could have perhaps addressed by way of heading off some obvious objections would be to make allowance for the fact that our efforts to create our little mini system of truth, our replica of God's system of truth, is subject to error. He admits that in this passage, but not just in a way that can be easily corrected, like the apparently bent stick, but think of the whole Ptolemaic model for how the planets and the sun relate to each other compared to the Copernican system. And if you declared that the Ptolemaic system was the truth, we have the truth and it's a replica of God's truth, as many people did. Even Calvin and Luther, I believe, more or less did hold that view. Then we have to at least allow for the fact that that's not knowledge. And then the question is, well, when can we tag our system as being knowledge, i.e. as being true? And so I think that Clark's fierce attack on empiricism should certainly throw up caution flags. At the very least, we probably need to hesitate to becoming dogmatic as to how these objects actually are in and of themselves. If you think of the Ptolemaic system as simply a mathematical model for prediction, then it's actually true as far as it goes, right? You could even continue using it today for many purposes. I guess I would say that empirical knowledge counts as knowledge, but more work is needed to be done, I guess, is the punchline here. We need to have our Van Tillian philosophers reflect more deeply on this subject, not as a way of fixing Van Til. No, I think on the contrary, Van Til has established that this model is the correct one. But now we need to, drive the fence poles deeper here and there, and ask the question, in what sense? Like, do we need a type of knowledge where we're not dogmatic about the truth, or is there a type of knowledge where the truth is asserted but with some tentativeness? Here again, this might be a good master's thesis for a budding young Van Tillian to pick up on and pursue. I'm always looking for topics and trying to propose them. It's a difficult one, though, because the pedigree of defining knowledge as justified true belief is a long one, and it can't be just tossed aside in a trivial kind of way, for sure. Well, this brings us to the end of chapter 4, so that's exciting. Next time we'll start a brand new chapter, which we only get to do every so often. So next time, chapter 5, the apologetical side of epistemology. See you then.